Have you ever wondered how far you would go to save an innocent life? Would you risk your own safety to intervene in a moment of terrible cruelty? Prepare yourself for a heart-wrenching tale of desperation, courage, and the incredible bond between humans and animals that will leave you both devastated and uplifted. In the bustling urban landscape of Boston, Massachusetts, where towering apartment buildings compete for space in the skyline, one tiny creature's life hung in the balance on what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. A golden retriever puppy, barely 8 weeks old, with soft golden fur and innocent brown eyes that had yet to witness the full spectrum of human kindness and cruelty. Michael Bennett, a 42-year-old maintenance worker with calloused hands and a quiet demeanor, was just completing his shift at the Harborview Towers, a 20-story residential building overlooking the Charles River. After 15 years of fixing leaky faucets and replacing burnt-out hallway lights, Michael believed he had seen everything there was to see in the building's ecosystem of human drama. Sarah Collins, a 28-year-old pediatric nurse with compassionate eyes and an instinct for sensing when something wasn't right, was returning home after a grueling 12-hour shift at Boston Children's Hospital. She lived on the 18th floor and was looking forward to nothing more than a hot shower and the company of her own rescue cat, Milo. The day had been unseasonably warm for April, with clear blue skies that gave no indication of the storm of emotions that would soon unfold on the building's rooftop terrace. An area that was supposed to be locked and accessible only to maintenance personnel had somehow become the stage for a potential tragedy that would connect strangers in ways they never anticipated. Daniel Winters, a 35-year-old resident with sunken cheeks and eyes that seemed permanently shadowed, had been spiraling for months after losing his job and receiving a devastating medical diagnosis. His neighbors knew little about him beyond occasional nods in the hallway and the occasional loud argument heard through the walls of apartment 19B. The golden retriever puppy, later to be named Lucky, had been purchased on impulse 3 weeks earlier by Daniel, a desperate attempt to find companionship during his darkest hours. But the responsibilities of caring for a young animal had quickly overwhelmed a man already struggling to care for himself, and resentment had replaced whatever affection initially existed. The building's community was diverse. Young professionals, retirees, families with children, and people from all walks of life who shared nothing more than an address and polite small talk in elevators. None of them could have predicted how their lives would intersect over the fate of one small trembling creature, whose only crime was being dependent on human kindness. The security cameras would later show Daniel entering the stairwell at 5:37 p.m., his face expressionless, wearing a dark hoodie despite the warm weather. In his arms, barely visible, was a small bundle of golden fur, whimpering softly as if sensing the dangerous intentions of the man who held its life literally in his hands. Michael had just finished repairing a stubborn ceiling leak on the 20th floor when he remembered he had left his tools on the rooftop earlier that day. It was a small deviation from his normal end-of-day routine: clock out, collect belongings, head home to his empty apartment, but it would prove to be the most consequential decision he had ever made. Sarah was in the elevator, her tired mind already drifting to thoughts of dinner and sleep, when she noticed the maintenance key in the elevator panel had been left turned to the roof access position. A small detail, the kind that her attentive mind would register even when exhausted, and one that would draw her into a situation she couldn't have imagined. A puppy, so young that his paws still seemed too large for his body, his eyes still holding that innocent wonder of a creature discovering the world, shivered in the spring breeze that swept across the rooftop. His tiny heart raced with an instinctual fear he couldn't comprehend, sensing only that something was terribly wrong with the human who held him. Boston spread out below them, streets filled with people going about their evening routines, families sitting down to dinner, students studying in cafes, all unaware of the drama unfolding 20 stories above. The city's indifference stood in stark contrast to the intensity of emotion concentrated on that rooftop, where life and death balanced on the edge of a concrete barrier. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the rooftop and painting the sky in hues of orange and pink that would typically inspire appreciation for nature's beauty. Instead, these colors would become the backdrop for a moment of human darkness and ultimately human redemption that would change lives forever. The tiny puppy's heart pounded within his chest, his small body trembling not just from the cool breeze but from a primal fear as Daniel's grip tightened around his soft middle. The puppy's whimpers grew more desperate, as though pleading for mercy from a world he had barely begun to experience. Daniel stood at the edge of the rooftop, his fingers digging into the puppy's soft fur as the tiny creature squirmed helplessly in his grasp. His mind was a tempest of dark thoughts, the culmination of months of despair after his diagnosis of stage 4 pancreatic cancer and the subsequent loss of his job when he could no longer hide his symptoms from his employers. The puppy had been a last-ditch effort to find something worth living for, a desperate grasp at companionship during his final months. Instead, the sleepless nights filled with the puppy's crying, the constant need for attention, and the messes on his apartment floor had become yet another burden he couldn't bear to shoulder. "It's too much," Daniel whispered, his voice carried away by the wind as he held the puppy higher, its small legs kicking frantically in the air. "I can't take care of you. I can't even take care of myself anymore." The diagnosis had given him 6 months at most, and 3 of those had already slipped away while medical bills piled up on his kitchen counter. The puppy's frightened whimpers grew louder, its tiny body contorting in a desperate attempt to escape the precarious position. Its innocent brown eyes, wide with terror, seemed to plead for mercy from a world it had only just begun to know, a world that, in this moment, was represented by the shaking hands of a man who had lost all hope. Below them, Boston continued its daily rhythm, cars honking, pedestrians crossing streets, people living their lives with a normalcy Daniel could no longer remember. The 18-story drop to the concrete below seemed to offer a definitive end to both their suffering, a thought that had crystallized in Daniel's mind during another sleepless night. As the puppy cried for attention, he didn't have the emotional strength to give. Michael Bennett pushed open the door to the rooftop, his mind focused on retrieving his forgotten toolbox. The setting sun momentarily blinded him, and it took a few seconds for his eyes to adjust and process the scene before him. A man standing at the edge of the roof, holding something small and golden over the precipice. "Hey!" Michael called out, his voice sharper than he intended, driven by an instinctive reaction to what he was witnessing. The single word echoed across the rooftop, causing Daniel to flinch and turn his head, his eyes vacant and rimmed with red, his grip on the puppy still dangerously tight. The maintenance worker took a cautious step forward, his heart hammering in his chest as he recognized both the resident from 19B and the tiny puppy he had seen Daniel bringing into the building just weeks earlier. "What are you doing up here, mister?" "Winters?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady, his eyes fixed on the trembling bundle of fur. Daniel didn't answer immediately, his gaze drifting back to the cityscape below, the lights beginning to twinkle as dusk descended. "It was a mistake," he finally said, his voice hollow. "Getting him was a mistake. I thought he would help, but he just makes everything harder." The puppy continued to writhe in his grasp, its whimpers becoming more desperate. At that moment, the rooftop door opened again and Sarah Collins stepped out, her nurse's instinct immediately registering the tension in the air. She froze, taking in the scene, Michael with his hands raised in a placating gesture, Daniel at the edge with the terrified puppy, and the dangerous drop that threatened to end a life that had barely begun. The puppy's eyes locked with Sarah's, and in that moment, it was as if the tiny creature was silently begging for someone, anyone, to save him from the nightmare he couldn't understand. His little body trembled violently, golden fur catching the last rays of sunlight as his paws paddled helplessly in the air. "Daniel," Sarah said gently, taking a careful step forward, her voice adopting the same soothing tone she used with frightened children at the hospital. "That puppy deserves a chance at life, just like everyone does." She had never spoken to Daniel before, but in this moment, using his name seemed essential to establishing a connection. Daniel's shoulders hunched forward, a visible manifestation of the weight he carried. "I'm dying," he said flatly, the words tumbling out to strangers because he had no one else to tell. "Cancer. 6 months, they said. That was 3 months ago." The puppy's whimpers seemed to grow more frantic, as if understanding that its fate hung on the emotional stability of a man who had none left to give. Michael's mind raced through his options. Could he rush forward and grab the puppy? Would that startle Daniel into dropping the innocent creature? Was there a way to talk him down from this terrible edge, both literally and figuratively? The stakes felt impossibly high, a tiny life balanced on the precipice of a decision that could not be undone. Sarah took another small step forward, her hands visible and open at her sides. "I understand feeling overwhelmed," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "That puppy is a responsibility you didn't fully anticipate, especially with everything else you're going through. But this isn't the answer, Daniel. This won't make your pain go away." The puppy's whimpers had transformed into desperate yelps now, each one piercing the tense air on the rooftop like a tiny siren of distress. His little paws flailed wildly, pink pads grasping at nothing but empty air, as Daniel's grip remained firm around his middle, dangling him over the precipice of the 20-story drop. "I never wanted to hurt him." Daniel's voice cracked, tears now freely streaming down his hollowed cheeks. "I thought he would make things better, make me feel less alone." The setting sun cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the gaunt features of a man who had been battling not just cancer, but the crushing isolation that came with it. Sarah took another cautious step forward, her nurse's training kicking in as she maintained eye contact with Daniel. "I believe you," she said softly, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "I can see that you're suffering, and I'm so sorry that you've had to face this alone." The puppy's eyes, wide with terror, darted between the three humans on the rooftop, somehow seeming to understand that his fate rested in their hands. His golden fur ruffled in the evening breeze, and for a moment, a shaft of sunset light illuminated him like a beacon against the darkening sky, his innocence a stark contrast to the human drama unfolding around him. Michael had been inching closer while Sarah spoke, his movements slow and deliberate to avoid startling Daniel. "Mr. Winters," he said gently now just a few feet away, "I lost my wife to cancer 5 years ago. I know it's not the same as going through it yourself, but I understand the darkness it brings." Daniel's hands began to tremble more violently, and for a heart-stopping moment his grip on the puppy seemed to loosen. The tiny creature let out a yelp so plaintive and frightened that all three humans felt it like a physical pain in their chests, a sound of pure fear that transcended species barriers. "I can't afford his food anymore," Daniel confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can't take him to the vet when he needs it. Can't even walk him when he needs to go out, because some days I can barely make it to the bathroom myself." The reality of his deteriorating condition hung in the air between them, as tangible as the puppy's desperate cries. Sarah, now close enough to see the tears tracking down Daniel's face, spoke with the compassion that had drawn her to nursing in the first place. "What if there was another option? What if you didn't have to bear this responsibility alone anymore?" She extended her hand, palm up, a gesture of offering rather than taking. The puppy's eyes, liquid brown pools of terror, seemed to find Sarah's, and in that moment something passed between them. A recognition, perhaps, or a desperate plea for help that went beyond words. His tiny pink tongue darted out to lick his nose, a gesture of anxiety that only heightened the vulnerability of his predicament. Daniel looked down at the puppy, really looked at him perhaps for the first time in weeks. The tiny creature's heartbeat was visible through his golden fur, racing with fear, yet somehow still trusting that the hands that held him wouldn't let him fall. "I never meant for it to come to this," Daniel admitted, his voice breaking. "I know," Michael said, taking another careful step forward. "We do desperate things when we're in pain, but this little guy, he deserves a chance. And maybe," he hesitated, then pressed on, "maybe you do too, Daniel. Not to face everything alone like this." The puppy let out another whimper, but this time it was different. Softer, almost questioning, as if sensing the shift in Daniel's emotions. His tiny paws continued to paddle in the air, but with less panic now, as if he somehow sensed that the worst of the danger had passed. Sarah, drawing on years of experience calming frightened children before difficult procedures, kept her voice steady and warm. "I have a cat at home. Rescued him myself a few years back. Best decision I ever made, but I've always had a soft spot for dogs too." She inched her hand closer, still not grabbing but offering. Daniel's breathing had become less ragged, the rise and fall of his chest more measured as he processed Sarah's words. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, he began to draw the puppy back from the edge, cradling the tiny golden body against his chest rather than dangling him over the abyss. The relief that washed over the rooftop was palpable, though no one dared to express it openly for fear of shattering the fragile moment. The puppy, sensing the change, let out a small whine and pressed his trembling body closer to Daniel's warmth, his survival instinct driving him to seek comfort even from the hands that had threatened him. The puppy, now cradled against Daniel's chest rather than suspended over the edge, snuggled closer, his tiny body still trembling, but his whimpers subsiding into occasional sniffles. His wet nose pressed against Daniel's collarbone, leaving a small damp spot on his hoodie, a simple gesture of trust that seemed almost miraculous given what had nearly transpired moments before. "He's still so young," Sarah observed gently, moving closer now that the immediate danger had passed. 8, maybe 9 weeks old? Her experienced eyes scanned the puppy's form, noting his healthy coat despite the circumstances, the bright alertness in his eyes now that terror was receding. Daniel nodded, his fingers unconsciously stroking the soft golden fur, an automatic gesture of comfort that seemed to soothe both human and canine. "The breeder said 8 weeks when I got him 3 weeks ago," he confirmed, his voice steadier now. "I named him Charlie, after my grandfather." Michael, sensing the danger had passed, lowered himself to sit on a nearby bench, intentionally creating a less confrontational atmosphere on the rooftop. "Charlie's a good name," he said with a small smile. "Strong name for a puppy who's clearly got a strong will to live." Charlie, as if understanding he was the subject of conversation, lifted his tiny head and looked between the 3 humans with an expression that seemed almost questioning, his pink tongue darting out to lick Daniel's chin in a gesture that drew a startled laugh from the man. "He does that every morning," Daniel admitted. "Wakes me up with puppy kisses." Sarah sat beside Michael, creating a small circle of connection rather than a confrontational standoff. "Daniel, would it be okay if I held him for a moment?" she asked, hands open but not grasping, allowing him the dignity of choice in this moment of vulnerability. With only slight hesitation, Daniel transferred the puppy to Sarah's waiting hands, his own fingers lingering for a moment on the soft fur before letting go. Charlie squirmed slightly in the transition, but quickly settled into Sarah's gentle hold, his brown eyes looking up at her with that uniquely canine mixture of trust and curiosity. "He's beautiful," Sarah murmured, examining the puppy with professional care, her fingers gently probing his small body to check for any injuries. "And he seems healthy, just frightened." She looked up at Daniel, compassion rather than judgment in her gaze. "Would you like to tell us more about what's been happening? Sometimes talking helps." The sun had almost completely set now, the rooftop illuminated by the ambient city lights and the soft glow from the stairwell door that remained propped open. In this gentler light, the harsh lines of Daniel's face seemed softened, the shadows under his eyes less pronounced as he watched Sarah cradle his puppy. "The diagnosis came 3 months ago," Daniel began, the words emerging easier now that the immediate crisis had passed. "Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. They gave me 6 months, maybe less, depending on how I responded to treatment." His hands, now empty without Charlie to hold, twisted together in his lap. Michael nodded, understanding darkening his features. "My wife, Anne. She had lymphoma. From diagnosis to..." He paused, cleared his throat. "To the end was 8 months. Longest and shortest months of my life all at once." The shared experience of cancer's touch created an unexpected bridge between the maintenance worker and the resident he'd barely known before today. Daniel's eyes filled again, but these tears seemed different from the desperate ones earlier. Cleaner somehow, a release rather than a symptom of his despair. "I got Charlie because everyone said I shouldn't be alone, that a pet might help, but I didn't think about what would happen to him when I..." He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Sarah, still cradling Charlie, who had now dozed off in her arms, exhausted from his ordeal, leaned forward slightly. "Daniel, what kind of support system do you have? Family, friends, anyone helping you through treatment?" The nurse in her couldn't help but assess the whole situation, looking for gaps where intervention might be possible. Daniel's bitter laugh contained no humor. "My parents are both gone. No siblings. I moved to Boston for a job that I no longer have because chemo makes it impossible to work 12-hour days in finance." The stark reality of his isolation hung in the air between them, explaining if not excusing his desperate act on the rooftop today. Charlie stirred in Sarah's arms, letting out a tiny yawn that revealed pink gums and miniature white teeth before settling back against her chest. The simple, trusting gesture seemed to captivate all 3 humans, a reminder of innocence, amidst their heavy conversation about mortality and isolation. "What if," Michael began hesitantly, "what if you had some help with Charlie?" The idea seemed to form as he spoke it, his eyes moving from the puppy to Daniel and back again. "I'm in the building all day. I could stop by, take him for walks when you're not feeling up to it. No charge." Sarah nodded, building on Michael's suggestion. "And I have experience with animals. I could help with vet visits, maybe pick up food when I'm getting supplies for my own cat." The spontaneous offers hung in the air, a lifeline neither had planned to extend when they stepped onto the rooftop, but now seemed the only natural response. Daniel stared at them both, disbelief evident in his expression. "You would do that? For a stranger? For me, after what I almost—" He glanced at Charlie, unable to complete the thought, the horror of what he'd nearly done in his moment of desperation washing over him anew. "Not just for you," Sarah said gently, looking down at the sleeping puppy in her arms. "For Charlie, too, and maybe a little bit for ourselves." She exchanged a look with Michael, an understanding passing between them that sometimes helping others was the best way to heal one's own wounds. 3 months later, the rooftop of Harborview Towers had transformed from a site of near tragedy to a place of unexpected communion. Charlie, now nearly twice the size he'd been on that fateful evening, bounded across the safe, fenced area, his golden fur gleaming in the summer sunshine as he chased a tennis ball thrown by Michael. His paws, no longer too big for his body, carried him with confidence and joy, a living embodiment of resilience and second chances. Daniel sat on a bench, noticeably thinner than before, but with a peace in his eyes that had been absent during his darkest moment. The aggressive chemotherapy had taken its toll on his body, but something in his spirit had strengthened in direct proportion to his physical decline. A paradox that Sarah had seen many times in her years of nursing. Charlie had become his reason to fight, to get up each morning despite the pain, to face another day, even when the treatments left him exhausted. "He's getting faster," Daniel observed with a tired smile as Charlie retrieved the ball and pranced back to Michael, tail wagging like a victory flag. "Yesterday he almost caught that squirrel that's been taunting him from the oak tree." The simple observation carried the weight of joyful normalcy, the kind that had seemed impossible on the night they'd all first met. Charlie's everyday antics had become the highlights of Daniel's days, small moments of pure joy that counterbalanced the struggle of his illness. What had begun as a spontaneous offer of help had evolved into something none of them could have anticipated, a support system that extended beyond caring for Charlie to caring for each other. Sarah brought homemade soup on her days off. Michael fixed things around Daniel's apartment that the building management would have taken weeks to address. Charlie, with his uncanny canine intuition, seemed to know exactly whose lap to climb into when spirits needed lifting, his warm weight and soulful eyes providing comfort without words. Charlie dropped the slobbery tennis ball at Daniel's feet and looked up expectantly, his brown eyes, now more confident and playful than fearful, fixed on his human with unmistakable love. The puppy who had once trembled in terror now embodied joyful energy, his resilience a daily reminder that darkness could give way to light, that second chances were always possible. His coat gleamed with health, testament to the care lavished upon him by not just one person, but an entire community that had formed around him. Daniel said as he mustered the strength to throw the ball again, not as far as Michael could, but far enough to send Charlie bounding away with enthusiasm. "When I got the diagnosis, I thought it was the end of everything. Now I realize it's just the end of one chapter." His gaze followed the puppy's path, a mixture of love and wonder in his tired eyes. Charlie represented not just companionship, but continuity, a life that would go on carrying the imprint of Daniel's love long after he was gone. Sarah nodded, understanding the profound shift in perspective that Daniel was describing. "Charlie needed you as much as you needed him," she observed quietly. "You just needed some help to see it." The puppy had become a bridge between 3 strangers, connecting them in ways none could have anticipated that spring evening. Charlie's near-tragic beginning had led to a tapestry of relationships that enriched all their lives, proving that sometimes our darkest moments contain the seeds of unexpected blessings. The support system they'd created had expanded beyond just the 3 of them. Other residents in the building, once they learned of Daniel's situation, began to contribute in their own ways. Mrs. Abernathy from 12C baked treats for both human and canine. The Rodriguez family from 8B offered to puppy sit when Daniel had medical appointments that Michael or Sarah couldn't accompany him to. Charlie had transformed an anonymous apartment building into a community, his golden presence a reminder of the difference small acts of kindness could make in a world that often seemed cold and indifferent. Charlie returned from his latest fetch expedition, this time dropping the ball at Sarah's feet and nudging her hand with his wet nose, a gesture that always made her laugh. "Equal opportunity, beggar," she commented as she threw the ball, watching as he raced after it with the single-minded focus that only dogs seemed capable of maintaining. Michael smiled at the interaction, remembering how close they had come to losing this vibrant creature, how a single moment of intervention had created ripples of connection that continued to expand outward in ways none of them could have predicted. Daniel's prognosis hadn't changed. The doctors still spoke in terms of months rather than years, but something fundamental had shifted in how he faced each day. "Even if my time is limited," he had told Sarah during a particularly difficult evening after a treatment session, "Charlie's isn't. Knowing he'll be loved and cared for, it makes all the difference." And in that truth lay the most powerful lesson Charlie had taught them all, that sometimes saving another life ends up saving your own in ways you never expected, that compassion creates connections that transcend even our deepest fears and darkest moments.